are called flood insurance rate maps. Jeez. Just a minute. Okay. Are called flood insurance rate maps. Okay. They're maintained by FEMA, and they are the official floodplain maps, and they get periodically updated, which is why we're here tonight. A couple things to note, on these maps are not going to show just any old flood event. What gets put on these maps are the areas that are at risk of getting flooded when we have what's called a 100-year flood event. And it's kind of an unfortunate term. It's sort of a misnomer because people think if we have a 100-year flood event, we're not going to have another one for another 99 years. But that's not how Mother Nature works. A better way to think of it is not in years. It's the flood event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. So that you'll hear those terms used interchangeably. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we have a 100-year or 1% flood event, these maps are not going to show every location perfectly because there are going to be some localized conditions that are just completely unpredictable. You have a down tree, a culvert that gets blocked, where water might behave a little differently in spots. But by and large, these maps should represent those areas at risk of flooding when we have a 1% or 100-year flood event. Okay. Floodplain maps get used for various purposes. They're used by Missoula County and the city of Missoula for where their local floodplain regulations apply. Because the city and county administer floodplain regulations and require floodplain permits in the areas mapped as 100-year floodplains, federally backed flood insurance is available to anyone in Missoula County or the city of Missoula. The maps are also used locally by community planning for planning, subdivision purposes. If you're in the county, they get used for septic permitting. And they're used by mortgage lenders to determine if a house they're financing or building has a risk of being flooded. They're also used by emergency management purposes to determine if there are roads that are going to be overtopped in a flood event or neighborhoods that are going to be blocked off, to be able to plan ahead for emergency evacuation, things like that. So given all that, we really recognize that these maps really should accurately represent those areas that are at risk of getting flooded when we have a big flood event. So we recognize that sometimes they need to be periodically updated, which is why we're here tonight. The city of Missoula and Missoula County have actually had floodplain maps since the 1970s. The map here in the upper right corner is one of the city of Missoula's first floodplain map, produced in 1974. They used the information that they had available at the time to depict the area at risk of getting flooded from a 100-year flood event. In the late 70s and the early 80s, there was some flood study work done to improve and update those maps with some engineering and flood study work. So new maps were produced in the late 80s for Missoula County and the city of Missoula. Fast forward to 2015, and in 2015, those maps were converted into digital format, looking like this map here you see at in the kind of center bottom. There have been a few small revisions and updates, one of which, one example is Milltown Dam. When that came out, that changed the floodplain, so there was a little revision to that area of the map. There have been a few other revisions and updates over time, but for the most part, your current floodplain maps in Missoula County and City of Missoula for the Clark Fork River, the Bitterroot River, and Rock Creek are mostly based on information and data collected in the late 70s and 80s. So they're pretty old. I know the maps say 2015, but they're really based on pretty old information. So that's why we're here today. The city and county requested updated data and better information to eventually update their existing floodplain maps. So we started working together and got some grant funding to start the project to update almost 100 miles of rivers that include the Clark Fork River from county line to county line, the Bitterroot River, and Rock Creek. The studies will eventually replace your current maps with new updated information. I'm not an engineer, so if you are interested in how flood studies are done, what goes into a flood study, all the technical information, there's a lot of data and analysis that goes into doing a flood study and updating maps. We do have a handout here that's on some of the tables about how flood studies are conducted. That's kind of an overview. So feel free to grab one of these on your way out. And if you have specific questions about some of that technical stuff, we definitely have some folks here in the room, the engineers. I would direct you to that to get some of those questions answered. One thing I forgot to mention, we do have a number of folks here tonight, but there are other folks that have been involved in these studies. So if we can't answer your questions tonight, make sure we write your contact information down and we get back to you, because we definitely want to get your questions answered if we are unable to do that. For those folks joining online, this flood study handout is available on the project website, which I'll talk about in just a bit. Okay, so the results of these flood studies that we've been working on are the draft floodplain maps. And we're now at the stage where these draft floodplain maps are available for review. Public review is a really important part of this process. We really want people to take a look at these maps and provide some feedback on them. An important thing to note, they are not in effect right now. They're not expected to be finalized for a while. It'll be a couple of years from now. But we wanted to get them out and having you take a look at them early in this process so you can start taking a look at those maps. A lot of the information that came from the flood studies, the draft maps, the reports, a lot of the details are posted on this website here. And there's a couple of ways to get there. Whether you got a postcard in the mail from the city or county, you can use the websites on those postcards to get to this location, or you can kind of get there directly by typing in this address here at the top. Give my pointer will work here. floodplain.mt.gov/Missoula-Granite, because remember this is a Missoula and Granite County project. On this website, in addition to a lot of the technical information and kind of overview information, is a button that says Draft Map Viewer. And that's what some of you have looked at these stations around the room or at home. We'll give you time to do that sort of here once I'm done here. But what I'm going to do right now is just kind of walk through what you'll see when you get to that draft map viewer to take a look at the maps. So when you first open that draft map viewer, what's going to pop up is the draft maps. You can, once you get here, you can use this magnifying glass here and type in your address, or you can kind of pan around and zoom in to get to your particular spot. When you're looking at the map, the blue areas of the map is what's being proposed as the draft 100-year floodplain. So that's the area, based on the new study information, that has a high risk of flooding when we have a 100-year or 1% flood events. That blue area is the area where the county and city floodplain regulations apply. So any new development needs to get a floodplain permit through them to make sure that whatever's being constructed is done safe enough and it's not going to have a negative impact on others when we have a flood event. It's also where a lender will require flood insurance if you have a mortgage on a building, because that's the area depicted as being a high risk of flooding when these new maps go into effect. Remember, I said they're not in effect right now. You have current maps that are in effect, and these are the new draft ones. If you have property in that blue area, we do have some information sheets that are at the table about what it means to have property in the 100-year floodplain. So make sure you pick up one of those before you leave tonight. Inside of that blue area, you'll also see a red area. That's the area of the 100-year floodplain where you'll typically see the deepest and fastest moving water in a big flood event. That's called the floodway portion of the floodplain. And that's the area, because it's is a more dangerous area of the floodplain, no new buildings are allowed to be constructed in that floodway portion of the floodplain. Another color that you'll see on these maps is a tan color. That's an area where you could see some very shallow flooding in a 100-year event, or areas that would take a larger event called a 500-year event that happens less often for those areas to see water in them. So we call that a more moderate flood risk area. That's the tan area on the maps. Outside of that, those two colors is an area of low flood risk. And I think this is a really good year to kind of, for us all to be cognizant of that. Low flood risk does not mean no flood risk. As we've seen in other parts of the state this year with the flooding that we saw over in Park and Stillwater and Carbon counties, flood events larger than 100 and 500-year events can and do occur and can significantly damage buildings. So those areas still do have a risk. It's just a lower risk. One other color that you're going to see when you're looking at these maps on the viewers or at home or here at home is a yellow color. And those are just to indicate other mapped floodplains in the county and city that we are not updating as part of this study. So you'll see Rattlesnake Creek, Lolo Creek, a bunch of other creeks and rivers that are not being updated as part of this. Okay. Once you're on that draft map viewer tab, that first one when you open it up, if you zoom in far enough, you're going to start to see these lines across the map. And those lines represent flood elevations. How high the water is expected to get in a 100-year event as you're moving upstream or downstream on the river. There's a couple other tabs on this viewer. On the left-hand side, it opens to that first tab, the draft maps, which everybody is kind of most interested in. But if you click on tab 2, it's going to show what your current floodplain maps are. The ones that I said were converted to digital in 2015, but still based on some pretty old information. So this is going to show those current maps. So you can toggle between the two of those if you're looking at your property. Tab 3 is kind of a comparison of those two. It's comparing the draft floodplain with the current floodplain. So, and kind of overlaying those. So, and it's only doing it for the 100-year floodplain, for that high risk area. You're not going to see that that moderate risk, the 500-year area in there. So anywhere that you see on this tab 3 that has a blue color is currently mapped as 100-year floodplain on your current maps. And based on the new study information is proposed to stay as 100-year floodplain. The studies determined that those areas were still at risk. The areas in green are the areas that the current floodplain maps show in the floodplain, but our new study information actually found that those areas actually aren't at risk of getting flooded when we have a 100-year or 1% flood event. So those are areas we're proposing to remove from the floodplain. The red color is the opposite of that. It's areas that are not currently mapped, but based on the new information, it's been determined that they actually are at risk of getting flooded. So those areas are proposed to be newly mapped as 100-year floodplain. Does that make sense? Okay. Tab 4 is very similar to that. It's just, instead, it's just looking at the floodway portion of the floodplain and what's being proposed to change for that, portion of the floodplain. Okay. So I want to point out there are some changes in the county and city. And one of the areas I just want to point out where there are probably some a little bit larger changes, and just want to kind of point out why that is and sort of what the new study information is saying. And I apologize that it's kind of hard to see the colors on here. We had to last minute hang up a screen here or a sheet here so you can see, but you can certainly see this on the at home or on the screens around the room. But this is the area kind of the Clark Fork River between Russell Street and the Orchard Homes area. And what the new study and modeling results were showing is that when we get a big flood event on the Clark Fork River, 100-year 1% flood event on the Clark Fork River, there starts to be some water that comes out of the banks of the Clark Fork just downstream of Russell Street and starts spilling over kind of in the River Road area and spreading west there. It's depicted on the draft maps as kind of a moderate risk because it's a pretty shallow flooding that kind of starts there. But in a flood event, as that water starts moving across Reserve Street, it starts gathering some more floodwaters from the Clark Fork River that are spilling out of the banks there and starts moving in a southwesterly direction around the Orchard Homes levee and before it gets back into the Clark Fork. So there are some changes here from the current maps. Some of these areas are currently mapped as having a moderate or low risk, and these results, some of them are proposed to change to, that there is a higher degree of risk in some of these spots. So if you own property in some of these areas, we're happy to talk to you about kind of what that might mean for your particular situation and moving forward. There was one other thing I was going to say. Oh yeah, in 2011 and 2018, I know there was some groundwater, high groundwater around the Orchard Homes area. I do want to point out that these studies are just looking at surface water flooding and not the effects of groundwater. Okay. So before you leave tonight, I just want to kind of reminder you want to make sure you know where your property and your house or your building is in relation to these draft floodplain boundaries and flood zones. Again, if you have property in that proposed draft floodplain, that high risk area, either the blue area or that red area, that floodway within that 100-year floodplain, make sure you pick up one of these sheets that kind of talk about some of that stuff. Let's see, what else was I going to say about that? And then one other comment, I guess, if you are in one of the moderate flood risk areas, that area shown on the map says that tan area, and you're in the county, I do want to encourage you to talk to Bailey or Matt in the back of the room, because you may need a permit from the county if you're doing any new development in that area, in those areas. Okay. Okay. All right. I kind of talked about these sheets, and I'm not going to go over them in detail, but I just want to kind of point out a few high-level things that they talk about. What does it mean to have property in a 100-year floodplain? Whether you currently have that or you are going to be newly mapped into those areas based on the new information. Well, in terms of development, as we talked about, the city and county have floodplain regulations that apply in those areas. So any new development, any new construction needs to get a floodplain permit from the county or city, depending on where you live. Doesn't mean necessarily you can't build in those areas, just means you need to build more safely and follow the regulations that are in place there. Typically, the main requirement is that new construction needs to be built so that that first floor is 2 feet above that flood elevation. So you're safe and high and dry in a flood event. In that floodway, the more dangerous part of the floodplain, again, no new buildings are permitted in those areas. What about flood insurance? I know that's a question that a lot of people have. If you have a building in that high risk flood area, so in that 100-year floodplain, and you have a mortgage on that building, your lender will require you to carry flood insurance once these new maps are finalized. If your building is in one of the lower risk areas, flood insurance is usually not required by your lender, but it's still recommended. Important to point out, landowners and renters can buy flood insurance, and homeowners insurance does not cover flooding. So flood insurance is really an important way to protect your investment in the case of a flood event. Another thing I want to mention is that both the city of Missoula and Missoula County participate in a national program that recognizes local floodplain efforts. And as a result of that, flood insurance policies in Missoula County and the city of Missoula automatically receive a discounted rate because of the city and county's efforts compared to other counties or other places of the country. Okay, so here's a timeline. This is on that project website, but this is kind of where we are in the process, kind of midway here. We've been working on this for a couple of years. As I said, we're at the point where we have draft data available for review, but we're still a few years out from these maps replacing your current maps. They have to go through a pretty lengthy public review process. We want people to take a look at them. That's a really important part of this process. And it will also include a more formal comment and appeal period, which will happen sometime probably in 2023. We will post a lot of these updates on that project website, so you can kind of keep track of sort of where things are moving from there, or you can always call your county or city contacts here or us at DNRC as well. So in the meantime, we encourage you to look at the draft maps and study information. If you see errors or things that just don't look right, we want to know that. Your feedback is really an important part of this process, so we really encourage and welcome your review. So now I really just want to give you time to look at the maps in your particular property. Everybody has slightly different kind of situations or things. So we really want to give you time to kind of take a look at and ask some individual questions with a lot of the resources that we have around the room. Before I do that and kind of let you kind of do that, are there any sort of general questions that folks have that are not like specific to your particular property that you probably don't want to discuss among your new 60 friends here. But go ahead, sir.
One of my questions is, okay, they removed the dam out in the Orange Grove area, where we do have flooding for Wall Drive. We had 100 years worth of sediment. The Fairgrounds district, irrigation district, they're across from Kelly Island. I know for a fact for 5 years, never took their diversion down, slowing everything up. Now we have sediment that is built up and diverting the river to impede and start working upon erosion of the levee. What is the state's reasoning or possible where does it come to the state that okay, we let the river start to run wild all the way to Anaconda from there in East Missoula. They went in and took out sediment. They got rid of stuff. But it seems west of there, they did nothing. And now the river's trying to make new channels and this and that. And it's working on the levee that protects quite a few of us. Why have we not seen, or why are there no efforts to work in that channel, to rip wrap the levee, things of that nature?
Okay, there was a lot there in that question. I'm going to try to repeat it for the folks online here. I think the question is really getting at changes that have happened sort of over time in and along the Clark Fork River in particular. You were talking about sediment that's moved downstream from changes that have happened or other things, and why there hasn't been more effort to address those. One you mentioned also riprap there. So I don't know if there's anybody here that would like to take a answer to that, but I guess the first thing I'll say is that one of what the goal or what our the purpose here with these maps, these updates, is really to try to, regardless of sort of what has happened over time, is to get an updated depiction of what's at risk today from getting flooded, so that that information can get out to you folks and other folks about what's at risk, so you can be aware of that and take appropriate action to kind of protect yourselves and know about that. So I don't know if there are other sort of longer term or larger scale efforts to do any big restoration or other work, but and so I don't know if anybody else would like to speak to that, or okay, where is that? Okay.
What are they doing to try to decrease the impact? Because insurance is really expensive. It's not like it's just, you know, a couple of $100 a day or a year, you know, especially on a big mortgage. So, why are we using money to try to and take away some of these things instead of just studying and saying, we're going to move there? I don't know how much you said it's about that take away that instead of and causing people.
Yeah. I will say, you know, riprap can be a tough deal, because sometimes what it's doing is it's sort of pushing the floodwaters onto somebody else or other areas. So even if you're protecting one spot, you do have to be cognizant of sort of what that overall effect is. The other thing I do want to point out is that I did show some areas where there are some changes for some increases in the floodplain, but there are some significant areas where the floodplain is being reduced. I know I talked to this gentleman here who's in one of those areas where that's coming out. So I don't have the acreages in my head at the moment here, but there's a pretty significant sort of shift on both sides there. So it's kind of a mix there. So Doug, maybe I'll have you, if you want to add to that. And then I think what I'll do is we'll turn it over so folks can get some of their individual questions answered. Here you go.
Yeah, thanks, Tiff. My name's Doug. I'm an engineer at the state. So I just thought I'd speak a little more to the riprap because it seems like that addresses both of those questions. Really, those are in a lot of ways questions for the more local community folks to make those kinds of moves. And the reason why that isn't done sort of along the way or more readily is because we're talking about this really big flood. And so in order to divert flows of that magnitude, you need a very thoroughly engineered and designed levee. So riprap may or may not hold up to that kind of flood or make a difference in that kind of flood. So it's just a really big undertaking. As part of this project, there are a couple of levees in the community that went through a recertification process so that the flood, the area behind the levee is shown as being protected. It's really expensive. You have to maintain those things and show a record of maintaining them. So I think those are good ideas. And like you said, there's this really unique sediment load situation from the removal of the Milltown Dam in the city. But I thought I could give at least a little bit of an answer of a bit of an iceberg of a topic, which is truly protecting structures from a 100-year flood is a really big undertaking.
Okay. I have a question to that while you're there.
Sure.
So the levy that goes through your home district right now,
Mm-hmm.
Are they maintaining it or are they choosing not to maintain it? Everything I get, they go, that's too much money for us to put in, and the river is now rerouting underneath that levee.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying, and we're now being put into this floodplain. And we're over a quarter mile away from the end of the levee. And so my question being is, what do they do to maintain the levee? Not build new levees or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a little more complicated of an answer. But part of the study results is
Maybe I can
take that. Sure.
Yeah, I think the levee is correct me if I'm wrong, they're in the county, that is being maintained by the county. But you're right, some of the situation is there's floodwaters that are getting in upstream of that levee and kind of flowing around that. So even maintaining that, it certainly does provide some reduced flood risk for some of these smaller flood events. But if you have a really big flood event, that levee, there may, based on the study results, there's just water kind of going all around that levee. So
you're saying that instead of the county or the city, which actually has the levee, instead of them maintaining it on our taxpayer dollars, we now have to bear the burden to be put into a floodplain that's going to increase our land values, make it harder to build and harder to sell, and just make life a little bit more harder for us, even though we're there.
Yeah.
That levee.
Yeah, I mean, it does provide some degree of protection, and so I guess I that's an important piece to make. But looking at some of the flooding that happened this year, being there for some of these large flood events, I mean, it really does flood insurance is an important piece of that, but to really help people recover from these flood events, because they can be really damaging. So that's one of the reasons, is trying to get this information out. I know some of it can be really hard to take the changes, but it is, we're just trying to get that information out so people are aware and can deal with it. So, okay, and then I do want to give you guys time to get your individual questions.
You talked about flood insurance.
Uh-huh.
As an older person on fixed income, rising taxes, all the other things going up, and now you want to add more flood insurance to our limited budgets. I understand what you're saying, but please understand, you have a majority of people that cannot afford, that will have to sell or lose their properties because you want more cost. And we have the inability to do it.
I am going to direct you to, we do have somebody from our office that deals a lot with flood insurance back there in the back table. So for other folks that do have questions about that, Tracy Sears is here to kind of talk through those questions, but I certainly do hear and understand that. So one more question, maybe if it's really general, and then I definitely want to give you guys time to get your individual questions answered. Go ahead.
So I live on the south side of 3rd Street, just by Stones.
Uh-huh.
2018, there was no water in my yard. When I built my house in 2015, I had good conversations with
Mm-hmm.
about how I should build my house. Out of the floodplain, why not have one?
Right.
He told me in 2015 that some map changes that one of my shops would no longer be in the floodplain. Therefore, none of my stuff was going to be in the flood. I paid $20,000. I brought in $20,000 worth of built my house up. It's a small space built, footings 2 feet above, 4 feet above base flood elevation. Now my entire company is in the flood zone.
Well, let's, okay,
So documented.
sure.
My question is, you can just fly out and fly over and map everything, but I spent a significant amount of time and money to build my place up the way that I was told was correct. What's the solution to that?
Yeah, what I would say is I would really encourage you to talk to some of these folks. So sometimes the maps are not going to show every little detail of if you've elevated a house or if you brought in fill in that particular situation. So you may have more detailed information that can be either provided now or later after the maps go effective, to that you actually are, maybe in your case, you may be above that. So I don't know for sure, but let's take a look at your individual situation and we can maybe provide some clarity there.
My other question is, since these maps have been being worked on last year.
A couple of years.
2 years, how many subdivisions have been approved and built it that are now going to lie?
I don't know the answer to how many subdivisions or development that has happened since then. I know the county and city have been aware of this. The results haven't been, weren't available until just recently. So that's, it's kind of hard to predict ahead of time, but I know they've been trying to certainly talk to folks ahead of time about new information maybe coming down the road and just being aware of that. So, okay. Great questions. Thanks so much for your time tonight. I'm gonna give you time to get your individual questions answered. If you've got other questions we didn't get to, please leave your name and number and we'll get back in touch with you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.